ontological arguments. So this one, we're on argument number 21, and this one is from Anselm. So I think it works best because it seems like you've got something to say about like every single one of these. So I feel like it's best if you just read them. What do you think?
Okay, well, some of them are pretty simple, so I could just say, hey, why don't you take this one when we come to a pretty simple one. And in fact, rather than go through this sort of more faithful to the text version of Anselm's argument, and this is the classic ontological argument from Anselm in Proslogion 2, let's just skip that one and go to the sort of simplified version next. There we go.
Is that what this one is? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, I'll read this one. A being than which no greater can be conceived exists at least in the mind. Premise 2, it is greater to exist in reality than to exist only in the mind. 3, so a being which no greater can be conceived exists not only in the mind but also in reality. And then the conclusion, so God exists.
There you go. Classic Anselmian ontological argument.
Yeah, this is actually the version of the ontological argument that most atheists on YouTube actually target, which is interesting, as we're going to see, because there's so many different versions. They kind of attack the oldest and the easiest to respond to.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so jumping forward from Anselm to Descartes, it is a famous quote by Descartes, which is that I clearly see that existence can no more be separated from the essence of God than can its having 3 angles equal to 2 right angles be separated from the essence of a triangle, or the idea of a mountain from the idea of a valley. So there is no less absurdity in thinking of a God, a supremely perfect being, who lacks existence, than in thinking of a mountain without a valley. And so he gives this argument. Premise 1. That'd be next slide there.
Sorry, there we go.
Yeah, if I cannot conceive of X without Y, then Y belongs to the nature of X. 2, I cannot conceive of a supremely perfect being without existence. So existence belongs to the nature of a supremely perfect being. 4, if existence belongs to the nature of a supremely perfect being, then a supremely perfect being exists. 5, a supremely perfect being exists. More or less included because of its historical importance. And I should note that Spinoza and Leibniz also had their own spins on the ontological argument, but their versions look pretty similar to Descartes' just outlined. So let's go ahead and move on.
Okay.
Now, just if you're interested in the history here, it's interesting that most philosophers thought the Anselmian argument we just covered just was the ontological argument until it was around the 1960s. Malcolm, what was his first name? Was it Ian Malcolm?
I'm the wrong person. Yeah, I'm the wrong person to ask. Sorry.
Malcolm published a paper where he argued that there's a distinct ontological argument separate from the one we just covered, which is more plausible and it's better. And this is in the literature. It's called. It's kind of referred to as Malcolm's bombshell argument, where he launched discussion of Anselm's other argument in Proslogion 3, not the argument in Proslogion 2. So we can skip the more complicated formulation and go straight to the simplified formulation where Plantinga and others sort of distill the Anselm's other argument down into this. Either God's existence is logically impossible or it is logically necessary. If God's existence is logically impossible, the concept of God is contradictory. The concept of God is not contradictory. So God's existence is logically necessary. And you see here, this ontological argument is starting to push into more contemporary terrain, which we'll get into. Okay. Hartshorne. Now, he had his own formulation of Anselm's other argument. And it's amusing that in the literature, Hartshorne actually published a paper, or was a book, where he said, no, there are these 2 distinct arguments in Anselm. There's the argument of Proslogion 2, and there's this distinct argument in Proslogion 3. Well, poor Hartshorne, he didn't get credit for noticing these distinct arguments, and Malcolm stole poor Hartshorne's thunder. So if you read Hartshorne's writings after Malcolm, gets all the credit. He's clearly bothered by this and has a grudge, so, which is kind of a funny like academic drama that happened in the history of ontological arguments, at least contemporary history. So Hartshorne's formulation, it's complicated. Thankfully, Robert Maydole has a nice simplification. His reconstruction is as follows. It's possible that a perfect being exists. Necessarily, if a perfect being exists, then a perfect being necessarily exists, so a perfect being exists. Okay, so to continue the drama, we have Hartshorne discovering Anselm's other argument in PROSLOGION 3, and Malcolm gets all the credit for it. A.D. Smith comes along and publishes a book called Anselm's Other Argument, where he discovers a third argument in Anselm, and it goes like this. This is the next slide here. If anything that cannot be conceived to be caused can be conceived to exist, it actually exists. God can be conceived to exist, but cannot be conceived to be caused. Therefore, God actually exists. And he gives some modifications later on that we can skip. If you're interested in this argument, look at A.D. Smith's book, Anselm's Other Argument. When I was writing my dissertation, I was reading this book of his, and I wrote up this long email asking clarificatory questions on some things he was saying in one of the chapters. And it was very well written. I'd done my due diligence and research and reading this book, and I was about ready to send it off to him. And I looked up his email address and discovered that he had passed away. So, so you can't always check to see if the person's still alive before you send them the email.
Fortunately, well, the next guy that we're talking about is still alive, Plantinga, Alvin Plantinga. And yeah, why don't you? Well, I'll read this one. I'll read this one. I'm fairly familiar with his version.
Let's just define some crucial terms here. Maximal excellence is a being has maximal excellence if it's omniscient, omnipotent, and perfectly good. A being has maximal greatness if it has maximal excellence in all possible worlds. Okay.
All right. With that out of the way, or with those definitions out there, there is a possible world in which a maximally great being exists. 2, if there is a possible world in which a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in all possible worlds, including the actual world. And then the conclusion, so a maximally great being exists in all possible worlds, including the actual world.
The key insight that Plantinga is known for when it comes to the ontological argument, the objection to ontological arguments, the biggest objection is that, existence is not a perfection. You can't infer that God exists from the idea that existence is greater. Well, Plantinga's key insight is that, well, fine, existence might not be a perfection, but necessary existence is. So that's his key insight. And granted that, you can distill modern ontological arguments into a very, very simple argument that has basically just one premise, and it's that God possibly exists. Because if God exists, it's pretty much universally agreed that God exists necessarily. But it follows immediately in two modal systems, modal system S5 and B, that if something is possibly necessary, it is necessary. So if God possibly exists, God exists. So we have the simplified, broken down as simple as you can get, possibly God exists, so God exists. And the contemporary discussion on ontological arguments takes this basically for granted. It says, yes, this is what it boils down to. Does God possibly exist? And we have arguments for and against that key possibility premise, possibly God exists. But as a good faith gesture, if you're not convinced that it follows that God exists from it's even being possible that God exists, here are two ways to derive that. Next slide. So the first way is in S5, and the second way is in the weaker system, B. And it's kind of puzzling. A lot of the cosmological arguments we looked at earlier depend on S5, as do ontological arguments, but I don't see many philosophers appealing to B instead of S5. S5 is much stronger than B. Usually you go for something weaker than what's stronger. So It's kind of a curiosity. Why don't they appeal to B instead of S5? So, yeah, that's where we're at. If you want to go to the next slide, all of the action right now in ontological. How far should I back up?
So well, let me just let everyone know that we're back. My software crashed. It's been crashing a lot more lately, so I apologize about that. But good thing is that normally I can pull it back up fairly quickly. So you were talking about, I think you were talking about, well, now I don't know.
Okay, well, the contemporary state of the discussion for the ontological argument is how to defend that key possibility premise, possibly God exists. And there are there are two ways you could do this. One is by offering what I'm going to call a defense, and the other is by offering what I'll call a demonstration. You actually try to prove that it's possible that God exists, rather than just give an argument for why it's possible that God exists. Arguments for the possibility premise, which we'll look at. We have Pruss's motivational center of our lives defense. We have Benjamin Arber's cumulative credence raiser argument. We have the axiarchic defense, ontomystical defense. We'll look at all those. And then we have, lastly, a phenomenal defense, which I couldn't resist putting in there because it's my own defense, which just got accepted for publication. So If I could run through that really quickly. So the phenomenal defense depends on a view in philosophy just known as phenomenal conservatism, which is that if it appears to you that P, then you're prima facie justified in believing P. Now, this applies, I argue that this applies to appearances of possibility too, but with a qualification. So if something appears possible to you, that just means that you don't see anything contradictory or unclear about it. But if something appears impossible to you, then presumably you do see something contradictory or unclear about it. So here's an example. Suppose there is a barber who shaves all and only those men in town who do not shave themselves. You might think, well, that seems possible. That appears possible. But when you think about it a little bit harder, you start running into troubles. If the barber, who's a man in town, does not shave himself, well, then that means he must shave himself, which is a contradiction. Okay, so hence I propose the following modal principle. I am prima facie justified at face value, in believing P is possible based on its appearing possible to me, if and only if it's reasonable to believe that if P were impossible, it would probably appear impossible upon further reflection, just like in the barber example. So I apply this to the ontological argument and say, look, it appears possible that God exists. It's reasonable for me to believe that if it were impossible that God exists, it would probably appear to me that it's impossible that God exists upon further reflection, but it doesn't. When I further reflect on God's existence, nothing seems impossible or unclear about that, contradictory about that, so I'm justified in believing God possibly exists.
That is super interesting.
That's my own defense, yeah.
Man, I wish we need to do a whole episode just on that, to be honest.
Ah, yeah, that'd be fun.
So
yeah,
cool.
You can see that it's coming out in International Journal for Philosophy and Religion.
All right, and let's see if we can get through some of these others a little bit quicker.
Yeah, so now let's move on to demonstrations of the possibility premise. And we have Gödel's attempted demonstration. Let's do this because it's important. Okay, so it depends on some definitions and some axioms, and he derives from the definitions and axioms 3 theorems, T1, T2, T3. And rather than go through all of those, let me just say that T1, T2, and T3 do follow from the definitions and axioms. No one disputes this. This has been demonstrated many times over, even by computers, okay? So T1, T2, T3 follow from the definitions and A1 through A5. The question is whether the axioms are true. And
because the definitions are just like, you can just make any kind of definition that you want.
Right. And so the drama really concerns the first 2 axioms. What is a positive property? That's the question. And is it a property that's better to have than not? Is it a property that doesn't detract from excellence, but its opposite does? So there's some debate here about that. Well, Alexander Pruss, of course, he has a simplified version of Gödel's argument, which just depends on 3 axioms. If you want to move on to this next slide. So there you have some resources on Gödel's argument. So Pruss's improvement just depends on those 3 axioms, which jointly entail the theorem: there is a necessarily existing being that essentially has P, which is all positive properties. So there you go. So Gödel's main insight is that, oh, we can prove that God possibly exists by this idea that he has all positive perfections. Maydole follows suit with his own argument to this effect. And this is his celebrated modal perfection argument, which is in the Blackwell Companion. He has 2 definitions here. Property is a perfection only if it is necessarily better to have than not. Something has a property of being supreme if and only if it's impossible for something to be greater and impossible for there to be something else than which is not greater. Okay, so from these 2 definitions, he has this argument: a property is a perfection only if its negation is not. Perfections entail only perfections. The property of being supreme is a perfection. So it's possible that a supreme being exists. And he derives 4 in Gödelian fashion from 1 through 3. So 1 through 3 jointly entail 4. 5, if it is possible that a supreme being exists, a supreme being exists. 6, so a supreme being exists. What's noteworthy about Maydole's argument is that it doesn't depend on S5 or B like the other arguments do. He instead appeals to what's called the Barkin formula in modal logic, which is that if possibly something has F, then there is something that is possibly F. That's the Barkin formula in kind of a rough way. So he derives 5 using the Barkin formula. And so he concludes that a supreme being exists. And if you want to go to the next slide, I'll just show you his derivation. That's how he does it. So premise 2 there is the Barkin formula. And he's off and running. So there you go.
Yeah, this is all just super easy stuff. Everyone should just be able to read this logical notation with no problems. Look,
I mean, if you were to write these premises out in English, it would be ridiculous. You wouldn't even be able to like hold some of these premises in your mind. It's like just doing a math equation. You know, the important thing is just showing validity. Is just showing that you can derive a conclusion from formal assumptions and premises. Okay.
All right.
So, yeah, Bernstein's argument, which again is a demonstration of the possibility premise or an attempted one. He defines a perfection as a property that in no way detracts from a being's greatness, but its complement does, its opposite does. So he has this argument. Suppose for reductio, it's impossible that something has all perfections. If it is impossible that something has all perfections, then there is a perfection that is sufficient for not having that some, let me restart that. 2, if it's impossible that something has all perfections, then there is a perfection that is sufficient for not having some other perfection, namely the one with which it is inconsistent. If a property is sufficient for not having some perfection, then that property is sufficient for being imperfect. If a property is sufficient for being imperfect, then it is not a perfection. So there is some perfection that is sufficient for not having some perfection, follows from 1 and 2. So there is some perfection that is sufficient for being imperfect, 3 and 5. And then we have a contradiction here. There is some perfection that is not a perfection. And so that means our starting assumption must have been false. And so we can conclude possibly something has all perfections.
All right, so we're at argument number 30. Is this a good place to pause and do some more push-ups?
There's one argument left for ontological, so let's get that one out of the way.
Let's wait. Okay. Yeah, and so here's the further resources for that one from Bernstein. All right,
okay,
Nagasawa's. Then this one is the most recent, from what I understand.
Yeah, pretty much. And Nagasawa's main insight is this. It's that we shouldn't start with separate ideas of what it means to be omniscient, what it means to be omnipotent, or morally perfect, and so on, and then add all those concepts together to get God. He says instead, we should just define God as the being that has the maximum consistent set of knowledge, power, goodness, and so on. So whatever being has that maximally consistent set, that is God. So he defines two properties: real maximal excellence, which is having the maximal consistent set of knowledge, power, and goodness, and real maximal greatness, which is real maximal excellence in every possible world. And he has this argument. It runs exactly like Plantinga's argument, except that we avoid the problem of whether or not the concept of God is logically consistent, because that's just built into the argument now. There's a possible world in which real maximal great being exists. That's just now true by definition. Here's a way to illustrate Nagasawa's point. When I was in middle school, I played. I'm a big wrestling fan, pro wrestling fan. I played this. I forget which one was out then. I think it was just called like SmackDown or something. But the SmackDown game, you could create your own character, and you could make him super fast. You could make him super strong. You could make him super agile, and super tough. And of course, being the middle school boy I went in there. I immediately like maxed out strength. Like, yeah, I want the strongest guy possible. But it became obvious pretty quickly when I tried to play the character that he was just some big lumbering oaf. He couldn't really move around much, and he was just like slow, and he'd fall over easily, but he was super powerful. So what you would do then is go back to create your player mode, and then you would decrease strength in tandem with increasing agility, speed, and so forth until you reach some maximum of each of the individual characteristics for an ideal character. So that's basically what Nagasawa is doing here. He's saying rather than maximize each individual attribute, let's just bring them all down to wherever they're at, wherever they need to be to all be sort of mutually consistent.
Seems to me like the question then would be like, would that being, whatever that being is, would that being exist necessarily?
Exist necessarily? Yeah, maybe my question would be, well, what if the maximally consistent set of attributes is just really unimpressive? What if it's just like what if it amounts to like no more than like a Zeus type being, you know? Would we consider that God at that point? And I asked Eugen about this actually in preparation, and he said, well, it's on the atheist, it's on the critic to show that the maximally consistent set of attributes would be a very unimpressive non-godlike being. So, okay.
I should also mention that I've had Eugen, and I should know his name, but it's escaping me because I'm already starting to get fatigued from this. But Eugen actually co-wrote an article. Mike Almeida, there it is. Mike Almeida co-wrote an article that's on Capturing Christianity right now, which you can go capturingchristianity.com and you can read the article that they wrote for Capturing Christianity that is along the same lines. Actually, the name of it is called A Faultless Modal Ontological Argument, I believe. But you can look that up, and it's along the same lines. Super, super interesting. If you're interested in ontological arguments, I highly recommend checking it out.